We certainly know in the society we live in that very few people accept these early chapters of Genesis, or in fact much at all in the Bible, as an accurate record of history. And I suppose we shouldn't expect anything different from the godless world that we live in, that people would reject this as an accurate record of history. What does surprise me in particular is how many Christians, how many people who say they are Bible-believing Christians, have serious doubts over these early chapters of Genesis. Why Christians feel like they have to compromise with these early chapters and try and synchronise the biblical account with the secular account, the atheistic account, the account presented to us by those who the Bible itself calls fools. It's inconceivable to me why a Christian, why someone who says they hold to the inerrancy of the Word of God would seek to compromise and synchronise these two world philosophies. For those of you who have heard me over the last few weeks, it's pretty obvious I hold to a straightforward reading of these early chapters of Genesis. I believe God created the earth as it's described in Genesis chapter 1 in 6 literal consecutive days. This is confirmed in Moses' writing in Exodus, where in the middle of the Ten Commandments, Moses confirms that in 6 days God created everything, the earth and the heavens and all the animals that are contained within it. And again, a second time in Exodus, Moses repeats this claim that in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth and all the animals that are contained within it. Many say that the genealogies given in Genesis 4 and 5 and later on in Genesis 10 contain many gaps. I see no reason to believe that there are any gaps in those genealogies. In fact, I see a particular emphasis placed by the writer to ensure that we can read this and know that there is no gaps. When it comes to the story of the flood, an incredible number of Christians don't believe this story, or they believe some elements of this story and yet seek to compromise the story as it's presented. God devotes 4 chapters, Genesis 6, 7, 8 and 9, to describe this flood in great detail, in particular detail. Many Christians that I've encountered say, well, this was a flood that was in the Mesopotamian valley. This was a local flood, a local destruction. I find it hard to even engage in conversation with such people. When you read the account, it's unambiguous that this is a flood sent by God as a destruction on the entire world that was. Let's jump into the passage. In fact, I'm going to skip over the first 4 verses of Genesis 6. If anyone's particularly interested, there's great discussion and some controversy in Genesis chapter 6 verse 4 relating to the Nephilim. We haven't got time to investigate that subject, but quite a number of books have been written on that subject and all sorts of speculation have been engaged in there, but we're going to focus more on the flood account rather than the Nephilim. So we'll start at Genesis 6 verse 5. Then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And this is a shocking summary of the state of mankind. When you do your investigations, you find out little more than 1,500 years have passed at this point. But what we have here is God's assessment of the earth at this time, that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. This was the state of mankind, utterly corrupted, utterly evil. And many have speculated, well, there's probably only a few thousand people living on the earth at this moment, all contained around that Mesopotamian valley. That's simply unbelievable. At this point in time, given that people were living for centuries, it's more likely, even using conservative projections, that the population of the earth prior to the flood was many millions of people. Now we have fertility rates where women in our society have 2 or 3 children, or in some cultures they might have 5, 6, 7, 8 children. But in these days where women were living for centuries, just imagine the number of children that was likely that they were having. Many, many, many dozens was probably a commonplace. The Bible doesn't describe it, but yet we see people well advanced, many hundreds of years, still having children. So I can only assume that the earth at this point was filled with people and spread across the original earth that God had created. And God's assessment of these early people, God's assessment of this culture, was utterly depraved, utterly contemptuous, completely evil. I just wonder if the culture and society and the world that we live in today is much different in its state of iniquity, in its state of sin. I wonder how much different we are today, because as I look around, I see evil, I see war, I see destruction, I see a neglecting of God and a rejection of God. I see very few people that have a heart for God. And I just wonder if that antediluvian world that is described here is any different to the culture and world that we inhabit and live in today. And the Lord was sorry, verse 6, that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. So the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, creeping thing and birds of the air, for I am sorry that I have made them. So we have, through the Word of God, on numerous occasions, Bible writers ascribing to God human characteristics so that we can more understand the perspective of God. The technical word for that is anthropomorphic language. And here we have an example of that anthropomorphic language where God is seen to regret his decision. Of course, it's impossible for God to regret his decision. He knew the consequences of his decision before he made them. He knew where man would get to. But here we have that anthropomorphic language where God is grieving over this depraved world that he has created and what it has come to. And we see God's judgment. God isn't intending simply to wipe out humankind who he has created. It's quite clear, it's much more broad, his judgment, than just that. He's intending to wipe out his creation. He's intending to wipe out all the animals on the face of the earth, even the creeping things upon the face of the earth. The wrath of God for the unrighteousness of man that's seen across the face of the world, all of this earth was going to be judged. All of the earth that was going to be judged because of the sin of man. And we have in this population probably of many millions of people nothing but continual sin and continual direction towards turning away from God. And it seems hopeless until we read verse 8. And the buts in the Bible are, there's some wonderful buts in the Bible. And verse 8, but Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. This is the genealogy of Noah. Noah was a just man, perfect in his generations. Noah walked with God. So despite the fact that we have a society that's utterly corrupt to its core, there's one man amongst millions who stands out and is identified by God as a godly man, a man who walks after the heart and seeks after God. When you look early in the account of Genesis, we see one other man who walked with God, and that man was Enoch. And the description is very simple. Enoch walked with God, and he was not. And that's God's quaint way of saying Enoch was such a godly man that God took Enoch into heaven with him. And here again we see a man who walks with God, a man who seeks after God. The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. Sounds very similar to our earth that we see today. We're now in the 21st century. The 20th century was scattered with one gigantic war after another, death and destruction. We had the Great War, and people thought that was the war to end all wars. In the early 20th century, then the mid-20th century, we had the Second World War, which dwarfed the Great War. Many other skirmishes and tussles and destructions, and many millions of people lost their lives due to wars and dictators and the evil acts of men and women, and violence increasing upon the face of the earth. Very similar, it sounds, to this time of Noah, where violence filled the earth. Verse 12, so God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. What you'll notice in the text is the totality of the description. I haven't counted the number of times that the word all is mentioned, but it's just over and over and over again. The flood we're about to read about isn't God's condemnation on a cultural town in the Mesopotamian valley. This is God's judgment upon all creation. It's all corrupted. All flesh is corrupted. Man, animal, everything. And God said to Noah, the end of all flesh, again, all, the end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence. God just repeating himself with these condemnations and judgments against the creation that was. And behold, I will destroy them with the earth. Not only is God intending to destroy all animal life that is upon the face of the earth and all plant life that's upon the face of the earth, God intends to destroy the earth itself. He's going to wipe out that original creation that Adam and Eve were told to go out and fill. Psalm 104 gives an interesting angle on the whole flood account. Just reading from, you don't have to turn there, but I'll just read Psalm 104 verses 5 to 9, where it says, He established, that's God established the earth upon its foundations, so that it will not totter forever and ever. God covered it with the deep as the garment. That's God's description of what he did. He covered the earth with the great flood as a garment. The waters were standing above the mountains. Even the mountains that existed were covered by this flood. And then the psalmist tells us, at your rebuke, they fled. At the sound of your thunder, they hurried away. When God commanded the waters, they retreated. And then the psalmist goes on to tell us some important information, which I think helps us understand how the waters did subside. Because we're told the mountains rose and the valleys sank down to the place which you established for them. So I think what happened during the flood, not only was God judging the earth that was and destroying the animal life and the bird life and the plant life, God destroyed the earth and the topography and the geography itself. And I think God reshapes the earth. Just as he originally shaped it in Genesis 1, it talks about God pooling together the land and bringing it out of the waters. And I think originally, from the text, it's more than likely that the original earth was a simple collection of one supercontinent. And it's interesting to note that the atheists have caught up with this philosophy and they hold to an original supercontinent. That seems to be what the Bible describes in Genesis 1. But I think what happens during the flood and at the commencement of the flood, God destroys the earth that was. And the psalmist tells us during the flood, or towards the end of the flood, the mountains rose up and the valleys sank down. And I think that also contributed to the waters subsiding and the waters finding their place in the valleys of the ocean. Anyway, back in the Genesis account, Genesis 14 of chapter 6, God says to Noah, make yourself an ark of gopher wood. Make rooms in the ark and cover it inside and out with pitch. So seal it. Make it watertight inside and out, covered with pitch. And this is how you shall make it. The length of the ark shall be 300 cubits, its width 50 cubits, and its height 30 cubits. We can't be sure how long the cubit that Noah used was, but most speculations of ancient cubits put it likely at about 1.5 feet. So we're talking about probably, although we don't know precisely, but probably an ark, a ship, the length of 1.5 football fields. Perhaps as little as 1 football field, but maybe as long as 2 football fields. We don't have the details other than the cubits mentioned. There are several cubits in ancient times, and Noah is pre that ancient time, so we can't be completely sure, but a massive ark, a massive great ship. And I've heard modern day scoffers who like to ridicule the Bible say it's not possible to to make a wooden ship of that size. And they say this with great certainty. How could these ancient men possibly know how to build such a large ship made out of wood, a ship that we would struggle to build today with all of our technology? And my simple response to that is, how do we know what technologies these people had? Think of living for 900 plus years. Imagine the ingenuity, imagine the knowledge upon knowledge upon knowledge that you would gain. We don't know what technology these early men had, but the Bible certainly describes, before this event, men who were working with metal. They knew how to smelter. Right back at the beginning, these men were great men of intelligence and great ingenuity. And one thing I know for sure, they had the technology to build this great ark, because here it's described for us. Noah built it. And I've skipped over the passage, but it looks as if he had up to 120 years to build this great ship. And there's nothing to suggest that he didn't or couldn't have also got great help from a team of labourers, employing a team of workers to help him on this ship. Either way, he has up to 120 years to build this gigantic ship, and the Word of God tells us he built it. God goes on to describe and giving more details of the blueprint of this ship in verse 16. You shall make a window for the ark, and you shall finish it to a cubit from above. Now, that's a very vague description. I'm sure God gave Noah some more specific details, but whether this is one simple window, a cubit in height, or probably more likely a window, a cubit from the top of the ark that extended the entire way around the ark, is probably more likely, and that's definitely possible from the text, that description. We're told that he should also set a door, and set the door of the ark in its side, so one door. You shall make it with lower, second and third decks. So we have a 3-deck ark. And being the ingenious, industrial, very capable man that no doubt Noah was, it's very likely that there were, in addition to these 3 decks, also possibly other shelves, compartments, mezzanine levels, extensive storage space. Others that have got more time on their hands than I do have investigated the cubic meterage and carrying capacity of this ark, and there's been various suggestions that put the capacity of this ark of being able to carry up to 120,000 sheep-sized creatures. Modern-day scoffers laugh and say, well, that only allows for 60,000 pairs of animals. And we know upon the earth there's millions of species of animals. How could you possibly have got all the species that are alive on the earth into the ark? How could Noah have done it? Well, I don't read where it says that Noah had on the ark all the species of animals that are alive in the 21st century. There's been studies done by Christian scientists that suggested probably somewhere between 5 and 20,000 types of animals were on that ark. So there was plenty of space for all the animals. And people say, well, what about the big elephants and the dinosaurs and the giraffes, these gigantic beasts? How could they possibly have all got on the ark as well? Well, I don't think Noah was stupid, and I don't think God was stupid. You don't need to have a gigantic, fully grown, mature male and female elephant. You can have 2 juvenile elephants. They're still big, but why pick an elephant this big when you can pick an elephant this big? When you look at the animal kingdom, a sheep-sized animal is about the average. And people will say, well, there's much bigger animals. There are. But those much bigger animals start small. And there's also much smaller animals than sheep. So it's perfectly logistically possible for Noah to have put on all the types of animals that were in existence on the face of the earth at his time. The historic record here, that's exactly what Noah did. Verse 17, and behold, I myself am bringing floodwaters on the earth to destroy from under heaven all flesh, in which is the breath of life. Everything that is on the earth shall die. The record here goes out of its way to repeat over and over again the extent of this judgment of God. It's total. It's not local, it's total. Anyone who suggests that this account was a local flood makes God out to be a liar every time there is a flood, because we know there are floods that occur on a weekly and even daily basis all around the world. Floods are a regular thing. Local floods are a very regular thing. Worldwide floods are once only event, or once only judgment of God. And God is not a promise breaker, He's a promise keeper. We skip over to chapter 7, verse 1. Then the Lord said to Noah, "Come into the ark, you and all your household, because I have seen that you are righteous before me in this generation. You shall take with you 7 each of every clean animal, a male and his female, 2 each of animals that are unclean, a male and his female. Also 7 each of the birds of the air, male and female, to keep the species alive on the face of the earth. For after 7 more days I will cause it to rain on the earth 40 days and 40 nights, and I will destroy from the face of the earth all living things that I have made." And Noah did according to all that the Lord had commanded him. We're told earlier in this account that Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord. God saw in Noah a man who was obedient to the instructions and the word of God. And at the end, verse 5 tells us Noah did according to all that the Lord commanded him. It's quite likely, in fact it's almost certain, that Noah had many other sons prior to Shem, Ham and Japheth. And we hear nothing of any of them. And if he did have any other sons and daughters, they all perished. Reading from verse 11, continuing. In the 600th year of Noah's life, in the 2nd month, the 17th day of the month. Now you've got to understand, God is a God of particular detail. When he puts in detail like this, he does it for a purpose. And I think he does it in anticipation of coming generations of people who would turn this story into a mythological event. And today we have even Bible-believing so-called Christians who turn the story of Noah into an allegory or a myth, a tale set before us so that we can learn from it. It is a story that we can learn from, and we should learn from it, but it's also an historical event. The specific date given here by God on this year, in this month, on that day, God's making it clear this isn't a myth. This is an allegory. This really happened in the 600th year of Noah's life. On that day, all the fountains of the great deep were broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened, and the rain was on the earth 40 days and 40 nights. When you read through these early chapters, what we discover is that the hydrological system that existed prior to the flood appears to have been quite different to the hydrology that we have today. In Genesis 1, we have described for us the waters separated above the firmament and below the firmament. The waters below the firmament are much like our oceans today, but above the firmament there was an expanse of water described in similar fashions as the ocean. So there was a large body of water suspended in the sky, I think vastly more significant than we see in our clouds today. And part of the reason I believe that is we don't have enough clouds in the sky for it to rain for 40 days. So this original body of water that was in the sky in the antediluvian time was much more significant than the clouds that we see in our sky. But also in the text here, and it's also indicated in Genesis chapter 2, where it talks about a spring came out of Eden, divided into 4, creating 4 great rivers. We also see a hint that there were great subterranean pits of waters, oceans of waters under the land masses. And here it's described for us that God not only sent the rain, he had the water above the firmament come thundering down for 40 days, but he broke up the fountains of the deep, literally ripped apart the earth that was, and out of the earth that was, the water came spewing out. And in fact, when we investigate, we find that it rained for 40 days, but as we'll see as we go on, but the waters continued to prevail for up to 5 months. I think these waters of the fountains of the great deep continued to spew out for up to 5 months, contributing to create this great flood which would destroy the earth. We skip over to verse 17 now. Now the flood was on the earth 40 days. The waters increased and lifted up the ark, and it rose high above the earth. The waters prevailed and greatly increased on the earth, and the ark moved about on the surface of the waters, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth. Notice again, God's repeating himself. Noah's repeating the account. not a local flood, an exceeding prevailing of the waters on the earth. And all the high hills under the whole heaven were covered. Do you think Noah is wanting to make this clear to us? Do you think God is wanting to make this clear? Not a local flood, all entirely encompassing. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upwards, and the mountains were covered. Now, I've heard a very skilled argument that says, well, here we have in this verse a description of a local flood. Flood waters that nearly rose 15 cubits. And that's the argument that's presented by some people. That's probably about maybe 6 or 7 metres high flood water. My simple response to that, as eloquent an argument you might be able to present, do we really think that God and Noah are that stupid? If God was sending a flood that was going to be 6 metres high, do you really think Noah couldn't have walked up the nearest hill? Do we really think birds couldn't have flown up any tree that was more than 7 metres high and perched on its branches? What's being described here is the depth of water above the highest mountain, 15 cubits above the highest mountain tops across the whole surface of the land. It's not a local flood, it's a worldwide devastation and judgment by God. And we read in verse 21, and all flesh died that moved on the earth. Not some flesh, not the flesh that lived in the Mesopotamian valley. All flesh, birds and cattle, beasts, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, and every man. All in whose nostrils was the breath of the Spirit of life. All that was on the dry land died. So he destroyed all living things which were on the face of the ground, both man and cattle, creeping things, birds of the air. They were destroyed from the earth. Only Noah and those who were with him in the ark remained alive. And the waters prevailed on the earth 150 days. When you see a local flood, usually lasts minutes, hours, perhaps days. This flood, the waters of the flood prevailed 150 days. Well after the rain stopped, after the first 40 days, it continued on as the fountains of the great deep continued to spew out the waters that were contained within them. What's interesting, I find, is the secular, the atheistic, the big bangers, the scientists who study geology and archaeology and fossils. They've also, as they've studied the fossil layers and as they've studied the rocks, they've also discovered a time of a great destruction, a time of a great extinction. They've come up with the fanciful term, it's called the Permian-Triassic extinction event. And they placed this event at 252 million years ago, 250 million years ago. Well, we know that number's total rubbish. This great extinction, which is evidenced by the fossil record, occurred during the flood, when God sent the flood upon the whole earth to destroy the whole earth. The atheists understand that this great extinction occurred. They just don't know when it occurred. Their dating is wrong, despite the fancy names that they attribute. Let's continue reading in chapter 8, verse 1. Then God remembered Noah and every living thing, and all the animals that were with him in the ark, and God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters subsided. So God sent a strong wind. And we also know from that psalm that I read that he also raised up the hills and lowered the valleys. So combining with the reshaping of the earth and the sending of the wind, the waters began to reside, to draw back. And the fountains of the deep and the windows of heaven were also stopped. The water from the fountains of the deep was stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained, and the waters receded continually from the earth. At the end of the 150 days, the waters decreased. So this was a 150-day period of time where the waters increased, 5 months. Then the ark rested in the 7th month, the 17th day of the month, on the mountains of Ararat. There's been many a person that has gone in search of Noah's ark. Of course, Ararat, as we know it today, is in Turkey. But there's absolutely no reason for us to accept that the Ararat, the mountain that Noah landed on, the ark landed on, is the same mountain that we call Ararat today. One thing we know about humans, when people travel to a new location, they name places after places that are familiar to them. We live in New South Wales, in recognition of Wales in Great Britain. So there's no reason to believe Mount Ararat in Turkey was the mountain that this ark rested upon. I think what happens is the ark lands on a mountain, but Noah has absolutely no idea where he is. This wasn't a mountain he was familiar with. This was a piece of land the ark lands on. Everything else is water as far as the eye can see. There's no possible way he could have any clue where he was. He just calls it Ararat. After the ark has been there some time, verse 5, and the waters decrease continually until the 10th month. So 2.5 months later, the water's going down, down, down. In the 10th month, on the first day of the month, the tops of the mountains around about were seen. So you see this expansive destruction. This is just absolute destruction across the face of the earth. And after 2.5 months of receding, the tops of mountains start showing all about. You get the impression this isn't a local flood. In fact, if you read the text, I can't possibly understand how you could think this was anything but a worldwide flood. We read in verse 13, and it came to pass in the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, that the waters were dried up from the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and indeed the surface of the ground was dry. And in the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth was dried. The exact day was given when Noah went into the ark. The exact day was given when God designated that the earth was dry. And when you count those days, it's 371 days in total. 5 months, the waters increased, and over a period of 7 months, the waters decreased. Then God spoke to Noah, saying, "Go out of the ark, you and your wife and your sons' wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing of all flesh that is with you, birds and cattle, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, so that they may abound on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth." And for those who are familiar with Genesis 1, you'll remember that God gave the same command to both the animals that God created in that first week of creation and to Adam and Eve, "Go out, be fruitful and multiply." God says the same thing here to Noah and his family. Go out into the new earth. And as he goes out, here's an earth that's utterly destroyed. All the plant life annihilated. By this time, some seeds were springing up, some vines were springing up out of the ground, but otherwise, a completely reshaped landscape, a completely new creation, and I think for quite some months it's likely that Noah continued to live on some of the storage of food that he had in the ark. We probably don't have any time left to investigate chapter 9. Just as a quick summary, in verse 2 we see God gives fear of man to the animals. The animal kingdom is given a fear of man, certainly suggesting that there was no fear between man and animal prior to the flood. In verse 3, God gives permission to mankind to eat meat. Up until this point, the instruction was only to be vegetarian. In verses 5 and 6, interesting in the light of political discourse between Australia and Indonesia at the moment, God institutes capital punishment. Very much instituted by God. Well before the Levitical law, God says capital punishment is appropriate. For a murderer, his life shall be forfeit. In verses 8 to 17, we see the Noahic covenant established, whereby God promises to never again destroy the creation with a flood, and he gives the rainbow as the sign of that covenant to mankind, knowing that God won't do this terrible thing by destroying the earth with flood. In 20 to 23, we see Noah's sin, confirming that despite God's judgment poured out upon the earth, God still hasn't dealt with sin. We see Noah sinning in these verses. And then in verses 24 to 27, we see Noah's prophecy. The life of Noah finishes in verse 28, and Noah lived after the flood 350 years. So all the days of Noah were 950 years, and he died. God still hadn't dealt